Okay, so welcome to another episode of Dimwits, Dipshots, Dufuses, and Dullards. And as I always explain, I say dipshots in the first, few minutes because YouTube doesn't like swear words because I guess they're pansies over there. I think they don't understand that people swear on YouTube and that a lot of people don't make YouTube videos for kids or whatever. But anyway, today we're going to be talking a lot about the Attorney General named Pam Bondi. And honestly, even though I'm a blonde person myself, I'm very tempted to call her Pam Blondie be- because, let's face it, there's a negative stereotype about blondes, and she actually fits the bill. So does somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene. There's, I sometimes refer to myself as having blonde moments, and you can kind of get away with that if you're blonde. But I don't like it necessarily when people fit into their worst stereotypes about themselves, and she's one of those people who happens to do that. And well, she's also an awful person, so that doesn't help matters. When you're sort of a stereotypically ditzy blonde, but you're also just a rotten person overall. It's definitely not a good look. So, what am I talking about here? Basically, I'm talking about how Blondie hates checks and balances. All right? On the federal government. This is supposed to be the small government conservative movement, right? They're supposed to be pro states' rights and pro checks and balances on the overreach of the federal government. But I suppose it doesn't matter when you have a cult leader at the top that you have to constantly bow toward, like you're bowing toward Mecca. The constant massaging of the blessed body of the cult leader at the top. You gotta serve him his McDonald's burgers on a silver platter and all that. So, all right, on April 5th, 2025, pretty recently, about 5 days ago, the United States began enforcing a universal 10% tariff on imports, with plans to implement higher rates ranging from 11% to 50% on specific countries by April 9th. European Union imports, they said, will face a 20% tariff, while Chinese goods will supposedly be subjected to a 34% tariff, cumulatively resulting in a 54% levy on Chinese products. That's what was on the menu. But, they keep on changing their minds about whether or not they want to have these tariffs imposed. And a lot of sane minds will point out that tariffs are supposed to be targeted. They're not supposed to be a universal thing. That's a ridiculous thing to do. It kind of defies the very purpose of a tariff, which is to have a trade policy that has specific goals in mind, not just punishing everybody. That's sort of dumb that somebody would want to have universal tariffs. Because again, they're supposed to be a strategic tool that you're not supposed to. It's like the expression of seeing a nail everywhere if you're a hammer. That's not something you're supposed to be doing. So these measures branded as Liberation Day, which is also a cringeworthy thing to call them. Like, Trump is so fucking weird, he says all these weird things like Liberation Day. That's a weird thing to call that. What? Like, I guess liberation from understandable trade policy. But the coverage lets us know that even though the stock market took a massive plunge, well, now it's supposedly soaring again because he canceled the tariffs, or postponed them. So, what does that mean? Does that mean it's like a stable policy? Well, not necessarily. What it means is that the stock market is volatile, as they say. That's the constant expression being used. And people have raised concerns about potential global economic repercussions. So I won't pretend to understand the stock market exactly because I'm not one of those people. I'm not one of those people who's deeply involved in that or anything. But the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, has warned that a universal 10% increase in U.S. tariffs, coupled with retaliatory actions from the euro area and China, could reduce U.S. GDP by 1% and global GDP by 0.5%. So, what does that mean? Well, in response to these policies, mass protests erupted nationwide and internationally on April 5th. Organized under the Hands Off movement, demonstrators opposed President Trump's trade policies and Elon Musk's leadership, if you want to call it that, of the Department of Government Efficiency, or Doge, which was originally a meme coin. So he's naming the Department of Government Efficiency after a joke, basically. The Doge thing is originally a weird internet meme, it's a joke. So I don't know how seriously you could. I mean, if you're getting laid off by Doge, I guess there have been tens of thousands of layoffs, and they also scramble to give some of those people their jobs back. And I've mentioned before on this podcast how this has impacted so many things. Like in the state of Michigan, there have been cuts to the people who are in charge of the waterways and who examine the invasive species that come in, like lampreys. So now there are concerns about Michigan waterways and the Great Lakes generally having an infestation of lampreys because they used to apparently take measures to control that population, but now apparently that has been slashed. So these are very far ranging things. And this, in the case of my example with the lampreys, it could have an impact on the ability for people to fish and, provide fish for restaurants in the state of Michigan. And again, other states that are impacted potentially by this. So for people who are, quick to dismiss all of these concerns, you should actually do some investigation and find out all of the different departments that are being impacted. And it could even be you, perhaps. And that is a very definite concern if you care at all about yourself. How are these changes going to impact me or people that I might care about? So, Doge has been instrumental in implementing significant federal workforce reductions, or firings if you want, resulting in over 216,000 job cuts. So, it's not just tens of thousands. I was kind of misspeaking earlier. It's over 200,000. And that was across major departments since its inception in January 2025. So think about that. Like in just uh, about 3 months, or like two and almost a half months, the Doge has made that sort of an impact. And protesters have voiced concerns over cuts to social programs and the administration's stance on civil liberties. Notably, Tesla showrooms became focal points for demonstrations, with activists urging consumers to boycott Tesla products and divest from its stock as part of the Tesla takedown campaign. And Attorney General Pam Bondi, she addressed the surge of over 170 lawsuits and 50 injunctions filed against the administration since January 20th, labeling these legal challenges as the true constitutional crisis. So it's not the fact that, these illegal firings have happened, and certainly there are some illegal firings. You're supposed to have a cause for the firings, from what I understand, and all that sort of stuff. But, Pam Bondi is suggesting that the ability for courts to hear these cases, that is the constitutional crisis. Even though, of course, as you learn in elementary school, or as you're supposed to learn, courtrooms are supposed to be a check on presidential power. You're supposed to be able to have, a system of checks and balances in there, and that includes judges and perhaps even individual cases that you can bring to the courts to challenge presidential power. And I know the Supreme Court has pretty disgustingly decided that a president has near absolute immunity if they can just claim that what they're doing is part of their official duty. But if the U.S. Supreme Court actually cared about their responsibility, they would seek a little bit more of a balanced approach, and they would, I guess, they would understand that the real constitutional crisis is giving a president the powers of a king. But Pam Bondi is going right along with the premise of a president having king-like powers. And all of this really suggests to the American people, if they're paying attention, that we really need to reduce the powers of a president. And that includes, the premise of having near absolute immunity, of course. If anything, I would say, because I care about reducing the dictatorial strength of any leader, I would say that they should actually have more checks on their power than the average citizen. You know, if you're going to have a leader like that, what they should be is mostly just a mascot, like Ronald McDonald or something like that. That should really be what a president does. He should have some negotiation powers with other countries, you know, and that should really be about it. It should be sort of a delegate that you could instantly recall if they're not doing their job. So they should have almost no power. And I know that's not a popular opinion. I know that's certainly not going to happen anytime soon or anything like that. But that's what this era of, the MAGA movement has demonstrated. We cannot trust people to have that sort of power. We need to redefine what a president is and what a president can do. And I would say similar things about, a lot of different politicians. There should be restrictions on what they have the ability to restrict. So when it comes to basic, rights that the citizenry has, like they shouldn't be able to tell us who can get married. They shouldn't be able to, I mean, so long as it's between consenting adults or whatever, other than that, it's none of their business. And they shouldn't be involved in, how high school sports are done. That should be up to the school districts. No more of these stupid attempts to ban trans athletes on the national level. That's not something that should be of concern to a president. They should have bigger issues, such as just basically managing the core aspects of the country. And if there is a war or something like that, then you know what? That should be mostly the matter of Congress, which has the supposed legal responsibility to declare war. You know, the main thing that Congress is involved in is passing laws and determining the budget and things like that. Now, Pam Bondi emphasized the significant power held by judges and expressed the administration's commitment to appealing adverse rulings up to the Supreme Court. Bondi also underscored President Trump's intention to comply with the law, which I don't believe for a second, but let's put that aside for now. And she highlighted his supposed electoral mandate. So he actually does not have a strong mandate. He had a mild victory. It was, well, like 1.4% as a victory or something along those lines. But President Trump intensified his criticism of the judiciary, and Pam, I almost called her Pam Gandhi. Pam Bondi has gone right along with that. And Trump called for the impeachment of judges who have ruled against his administration's policies. And the rhetoric has sparked debates about the balance of power among government branches and the potential implications for judicial independence. So, yeah, he's trying to make it so judges are no longer independent of his will, sort of like a dictator or something like that. So, these developments really show you the systemic issues inherent in centralized authority, the implementation of broad tariffs, and the consolidation of power within departments like Doge, which is sort of an imaginary department. Well, I mean, I guess they're all kind of imaginary in a way, but they exemplify how state mechanisms can disrupt economies and livelihoods. The mass protests reflect a collective resistance to authoritarian measures and highlight the importance of decentralized, community driven responses to government overreach. And the administration's confrontation with the judiciary, sorry, that's like a mouthful for me, but it just reveals the fragility of checks and balances within hierarchical systems and emphasizes the need for alternative structures that prioritize autonomy and mutual aid over coercive government. So, yeah, for segment number 2, I call that the peripheral poop head of the week, and that is Matt Gaetz. So keep in mind that originally he was going to have the job that Pam Bondi now has. But Matthew Gaetz, or Matthew Lewis Gaetz II, born on May 7th, 1982, so he's actually younger than me. Anyway, he's an American politician and lawyer known for his far right positions and strong support of Donald Trump. And, of course, he represented Florida's first congressional district in the U.S. House of Representatives from 2017 until his resignation in 2024. His district encompasses all of Escambia, Okaloosa, and Santa Rosa counties, along with parts of Walton County. He is a self proclaimed libertarian populist. Well, when does the liberty part come in? You know? But anyway, Gaetz is widely recognized for his alignment with far right politics and unwavering support for President Donald Trump. And I keep wanting to call him the former president, but alas, he is still in there now. Um, Gaetz hails from a politically active family, so his father, Don Gaetz, served as a prominent Florida politician, and his grandfather, Jerry Gaetz, was involved in North Dakota politics. So, of course, he's from a political dynasty of sorts. You know, another sign that the system is kind of rigged because all of these families with histories in the political system are active there. Anyway, he was raised in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. He earned his law degree from William and Mary Law School. Apparently, he didn't just get it from a Cracker Jack box, even though it seems like he did. He briefly practiced law before entering politics. His political career began in the Florida House of Representatives, where he served from 2010 to 2016. During his tenure, he gained national attention for his staunch defense of Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which permits individuals to use deadly force in self defense without the duty to retreat. And of course, he would have emphasized that because, the Republican Party really likes violence. They don't like helping people out, they like the ability to shoot people dead or, put them in a jail cell or launch bombs at them or things like that, just being a bully, you know, having shootouts in the streets or what, some type of macho type of crap. That's what they're all about. And they don't really want to help people out as much. They're into cutting the government and its ability to do anything to help people out. They're largely against serving school lunches to kids or whatever. That's somehow an extreme idea. The idea that a kid could go into a school and into a classroom on a full stomach, that's apparently a scandal. But you can always have more prisons for people or more wars or, you know, cutting the welfare state's ability to actually help people out when they're struggling, including, the elderly and kids. So, you know, Elon Musk has cut cancer research and things like that. The Meals on Wheels program is apparently facing significant cuts. There's talk of Medicaid being severely weakened, basically kneecapped. So I could go on and on about that. But in 2016, Gates was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and subsequently reelected 3 times. His tenure in Congress was marked by controversy. In 2020, allegations surfaced accusing Gates of, you know, child trafficking and statutory uh, sexual offenses. Let's just use that word instead. The U.S. Department of Justice investigated these claims, but ultimately decided not to press charges. Well, how about that? However, in December 2024, the House Ethics Committee released a report finding evidence that Gates had paid for sex, which is technically illegal. And that includes with a 17-year-old who had used illegal drugs during his time in Congress. And Matt Gaetz had allegedly used illegal drugs during his time in Congress. So, this isn't to even say what we're against or what I'm against. These are the things that the Republican Party would criticize people for, prostitution, using illegal drugs, and of course, being a well, what word could I use? With underage people, those are the things that they constantly go after people for, you know. So it's a little bit interesting how often it happens with the not only a random Republican, at the corner bar. You might expect somebody like that having a checkered past or something, but this is somebody who was a prominent member of government. In October 2023, Gates filed a motion to vacate, leading to the removal of Kevin McCarthy as Speaker of the House. And that was another ridiculous scandal. It demonstrated his influence and willingness to challenge party leadership if he thought it was going to benefit the big orange doofus at the top. On November 13th, 2024, President elect Donald Trump announced his intention to nominate Gates as the United States Attorney General, which is where Pam Bondi currently is. The nomination faced resistance from some Senate Republicans because, even they might have some standards at times. They know what Matt Gaetz is. Um, but following the announcement, Gates actually resigned from the House of Representatives because apparently he was under pressure because of, the scandals that I mentioned. A week later, he withdrew from consideration for the Attorney General position because he knew, presumably, that Trump and others might be able to blackmail him to get him to do their bidding, so he would be even more of a bitch boy, I suppose you could say. And you'll find that in Trump's orbit, he has a lot of these people who have checkered pasts, to put it lightly. And, a lot of people speculate that it could be precisely because it makes them more blackmailable. And that's one of the critiques that Matt Gaetz had and that others have, like Pete Hegseth, because of their scandalous histories. They are more easily blackmailed, both by Trump and by some international leaders who might be able to dig up some dirt on these people. So, despite having won re election in the 119th United States Congress, Matt Gaetz submitted his resignation before the new term commenced because I guess the heat was too great. And in January 2025, because these lame ass people just can't go away, Gates began hosting the Matt Gaetz Show, a political talk show airing weeknights on One American News Network, or OANN, which is literally probably one of the worst and goofiest right wing news shows out there. It's known for promoting conspiracy theories. They're the network that Trump retweeted on Twitter when the protester Martin Gugino was knocked over by a cop and he sustained an injury to his brain and he was bleeding out of his ear. I don't know if you remember that back in, I think, 2020 during the George Floyd protests. But Martin Gugino was bleeding out of his ear, pushed by that cop, and Trump was trying to claim that Martin Gugino might have staged the whole thing. So imagine that, you're getting knocked down, you're suffering a brain injury, you got your skull cracked open, there's blood literally coming out of your ear. But here is the president of the United States at the time claiming that, oh, maybe he splashed some ketchup or some stage blood on his ear to look like he was faking it. And Trump said he fell harder than he was pushed. And he suggested that Martin Gugino may have had some, some walkie-talkie scrambling equipment on him or something like that. It was just so weird. But it was the claim being made by One American News Network. So they should be called Dumb American News Network because that's what they're really pushing for. They want us all to be stupid and, believing in these spontaneous, bizarre conspiracy theories, such as that one. And that was really one of those moments when I first knew that, holy shit, Donald Trump is truly a not just kind of evil, but also just bizarre, like it was an episode of The Twilight Zone or something, to have the president of the United States claiming that protester who was injured by a cop somehow staged the whole thing. It was so bizarre, and just it really showed you that the power of the human mind is really wild and crazy, because the ability to just spontaneously create a lie like that, and as president of the United States, a person with great influence who should have, higher standards of what sort of information he puts out there. Well, he's just putting out this bizarre line about, these protesters. They're staging their own injuries. And now, of course, when it comes to the current protests, they're claiming that they're all paid. All of these protesters are paid. Well, no, no. I can go to a local protest, and guess what? No billionaire financier is paying for all those people to be there. But that's the current lie that they're presenting us with. But anyway, I guess my point is Matt Gaetz is writing for this wild and crazy and stupid ass OANN, and the show features Gates's perspectives, if you want to even call them that. They're probably just him making crap up because you don't really need to have standards if you're on a network like that. But I guess in a matter of speaking their perspectives, okay. But he talks about current events and he interviews political figures, most certainly lunatics. Uh, like he's probably not going to have any credible people on who really have anything of value to say. Gates's political career reflects a trajectory marked by staunch conservative positions. Well, if you want to call them that, I don't know. I don't know if you can even call yourself a traditionalist if you believe in throwing out the checks and balances of the government. And ironically, like I noted earlier, it's not even about states' rights. It's about the ability to have this orange doofus calling all of the shots and basically having the power of the Führer principle, which is the Führer principle, which was operating in Nazi Germany. And basically, what that meant is that the word of the leader was the law of the land. And that's exactly what is being approximated here with people like Pam Bondi and this freakish cult. And it's really one of the core reasons that people are protesting across the country. It's not just, the people losing their jobs, which, let's face it, can happen sometimes anyway. If there's a shakeup in government, some departments might get scrapped. Um, and you might have, of course, the the loss of individual jobs and whatnot. So this is not just about that. It's also about how much power a president should have, and how much power political figures in general should have. And it's obvious at this point that if Joe Biden had these sort of presidential powers, and if he was doing, a fraction of the things that Pam Bondi wants Trump to be able to do, well, these right wing critics would be endlessly going after, somebody like Joe Biden for these same overreaches. And if you recall, when Joe Biden was president, he was actually restricted by the Supreme Court over the intention of forgiving student loans. So they regarded that as an overreach. Well, this is a little bit more extreme because, the president right now is just trying to be able to deport anyone that he doesn't like. So there's no due process, at least if he has his way. He can just deport anybody willy nilly, and nobody's supposed to be able to say, hey, I actually have rights. At least give me a chance to plead my case. Well, if the MAGA morons have their way, that's not going to be a thing anymore. The president could just snap his fingers and deliver an edict, and this group gets to get deported. You can block anybody from the country. And, that's not how things are supposed to be. That's why I've said reduce the powers of the president. We need amendments upon amendments right now to sort of reel in the presidential powers. And to a large degree, we need to reel in the powers of these corporations, and the two-party system needs to be, facing more restrictions in general. You can have these politicians micromanaging every aspect of people's private lives the way they are doing, when it comes to decisions that don't even impact the health of the country. When it comes to like environmental restrictions or something, I think there's a fair argument to be made for that. Or health and safety standards in the workplace. Okay, I think most people would understand that, but like these these bizarre things about you know you you have to have uh, gay marriage be banned or something, because that's what they're going to go after next.